trust and the importance of closing the skills gap in digital skills. How do we do this? And do you have any examples of organizations who've done this successfully that we can learn from?
So one of the things that I find the most interesting right now occurring in the AI space is a move away from this approach of just AI it towards how do we start from the business challenge and work backwards. But part of that shift, which is the right shift, this culture of why question, is really looking at how do we address the business challenge in a way that is responsible, safe, and secure. And there's a big gap between organizations believing that responsibility is a top management issue. Around 85% of organizations right now believe responsible AI to be a top management issue. But only around 25% of organizations right now actually have internal governance mechanisms in place to address responsibility. And that gap exists for several reasons. The first reason is that we lack a shared vocabulary. And so if I talk, for example, to policymakers anywhere in the world, and I say to a policymaker, do you think transparency, explainability, accuracy, do you think these are important principles? Every single policymaker will say, yes, these are important principles. But if I sit down with an engineer in an organization and I say, can you please have an approach of responsibility by design and embed transparency, accountability, and explainability into your algorithm? A lot of engineers are going to say, can you please explain what you mean by that? And so one of the things that we see is absolutely essential in empowering organizations to centralize responsibility is helping them move from theory to practice. So helping them think through, what does transparency look like for a developer or a designer or a deployer of an AI system? And what does that look like across silos and across the AI lifecycle? So it's one of the reasons why we've really emphasized and prioritized closing the gap that exists between theory and practice by providing educational materials. And to link to your question on digital skills, here it's really important to emphasize that it's not just about understanding what AI is or what AI isn't. It's also about understanding what it means to develop and deploy it responsibly. Because the reality is that not everybody is going to be an AI coder, but everybody will, and I would say already does, interact with AI. So understandings around fairness and bias, those are things that need to be absolutely essential in the ways we think about upskilling individuals, not only to understand the technology, but also how to, and sometimes not to use it. So closing that gap is something that's really important. In parallel to that, one of the ways in which we're addressing this challenge is really investing in the science behind AI. And I've been in this field for almost 20 years, and the thing that keeps me up at night and that excites me the most is the ways in which we can actually use AI to address some of the risks related to AI. And I'll give you a couple of examples. We're using, for example, AI to develop bedrock guardrails, which helps filter out harmful content related to outputs of generative AI content. We're using AI to watermark audiovisual generated generative AI content because we share the concern around disinformation and what this technology might represent, but we also see the opportunity in using this technology to address that risk and come together across industry to standardize the ways in which we, for example, watermark content. And here, Bernard, I think it's really important to underline the importance of standardizing the ways in which we think about operationalizing responsibility, because we need to have a shared vocabulary in order to help organizations scale at a global level, which is fundamentally their ambition.
And I guess that's a challenge if we don't have regulation across all of these different parts of the world that aligns, that adds complexity, right?
100%. So one of the things that we're seeing right now in research that we commissioned recently is in Europe, for example, 68% of companies in Europe currently don't understand their obligations under the EU AI Act. And because of the lack of regulatory certainty, they actually intend to invest up to 30% less year on year in the technology. They also, in tandem, invest up to 46% of their overall IT spend on conformity questions, on questions related to compliance. So imagine you're a company in Europe and you want to compete on the global stage and you're in a marathon, but you're starting that marathon 46 kilometers behind. And so having a global approach to what responsibility and risk means is really essential because A, it reduces compliance costs, and B, it allows us to have a clear roadmap of what we have to do in order to scale. In Germany, you can drive really quickly on the Autobahn because the rules are clear. And so clear regulation actually allows innovators to adopt AI in a safe and responsible way and in tandem accelerate that adoption. And I think, Bernard, there are a couple of lessons from history that are super important to contextualize why this is so important. The first is actually the invention of standards work, which comes from the UK and the beginning of the train system. So in the beginning of train tracks inside of London were actually laid at different widths because the width of the train track was based on the distance that people estimated of the rear legs of a horse. But nobody could agree on the distance of the rear legs of the horse. And so inside of London, you'd move goods and then you'd have to take the goods off of the train and then reload them onto another train with train tracks of a different size. And so it meant that goods didn't get to people quickly. And it stalled the delivery of value, sometimes food that went bad because it took so long to get there, because there was no shared definition or shared understanding of what that risk represented. And so I think work, for example, of the International Standards Organization is really important because those are the compliance details that help organizations say, I would like to scale my incredible solution from the UK to France and Germany and Brazil and the United States. Here's the roadmap. Here's the mapping of risk. We have a shared vocabulary and we can go quickly. So that's something that I think we can draw from history. The other example, which also comes from the United Kingdom in the mid-1800s, is the introduction of the Red Flags Act. So in the middle of the 1800s, when cars were first introduced in London, there was a regulation that said, we don't really understand the risk yet of what this car thing represents. We are going to limit the speed limit of cars inside of London to 2 kilometers per hour. And in front of the car, because we're not really sure of the risk, we're going to ask somebody to walk in front of it, blowing a horn and waving a red flag to warn everybody that the car is coming. What happened fundamentally is that A, people didn't use cars, they walked because it was faster, and B, other areas, such in France or Germany, steamed ahead in the production of their car manufacturing industry, while the car manufacturing industry in the mid-1800s in the United Kingdom stalled. And by the time the Red Flags Act was repealed, France and Germany had steamed ahead in their car industry and were known worldwide. So clear regulation based on shared definitions and a shared understanding of real risk is something that's absolutely essential. And I would say the secret sauce ingredient to thinking through how can we create this pro-innovation environment where regulation actually empowers responsibility and innovation going hand in hand.
Yeah, I love those lessons from history. You operate worldwide.
Yeah.
Do you see differences between Europe and the US and other parts of the world?
Yeah, one of the things, to your point, one of the things that we did is we became the first generative AI company to be certified with the ISO 42001 standard. So this is a standard that is meant to mitigate AI risks, and it's designed to help organizations deal with managing AI systems. And before we were certified with that standard, because we were the first generative AI company to go through this process, it was actually quite an in-depth audit that we had to go through. But what that enabled us to do is whenever we would have conversations with organizations, especially large organizations, there were always questions around compliance, governance, risk. And our legal team and their legal team would and our security teams would have these lengthy conversations over sometimes months till we can get to the commercial aspects of the contract. But now that we're ISO 42001 certified, that means that those conversations have been rapidly accelerated, and we can skip through to the kind of commercial, for the most part, skip to the commercial conversation. And so that's kind of an example of how to your point, these kind of global standards could accelerate AI adoption because you're not wasting time coming to a shared understanding of the definitions. Because there's a standard, it's very clear on AI systems and their risk, and you've been audited, certified, and everyone has a shared understanding, but also a shared trust. So I think it's not just important to have, I agree with you, it's important to have very clear regulation, but it's also important to have technical standards, because those things actually, in our experience, accelerate AI adoption as well, because they create this kind of trustworthy environment where businesses can communicate. So I think that's kind of one part of it. And then the other part of it has been our experience is we've been around for more than 8 years, and at the very beginning of the company, our founders realized that AI video is a very powerful technology, but it's also very personal technology as well. And they set they set up this framework we call the 3 C's framework, so consent, control, and collaboration. And you could say, to your point, what does that mean in practice? And we got very serious about operationalizing that framework in practice. So, for example, for consent, we don't generate non-consensual deepfakes, which are one of the sort of largest sources of harmful content. With control, we give enterprises control of the platform, of their workspace, of how they create AI content on the platform, and then we also check videos before they're generated for any harmful or illegal content. And collaboration, I think it's actually one of those things that, again, it can be quite fuzzy, but we've operationalized that in the sense of we want to work with governments, we want to work with nonprofits and kind of civil society to explain the advantages of the technology and the benefits, but also hear from them about the risks and make sure that we're doing the right thing as well. And that's been, for the past 8 years, it's been this kind of a recipe that has positioned us for success, not just in terms of how we build the technology, but now we see sort of the benefits in the companies that do business with us. Because we have these kind of very simple principles and they're very easy to understand, it translates into, again, building trust and adopting the technology as well.
Yeah, great. That's good to hear. They're really good principles, I think, to have. The role of technology then, having the right modern technology stack in place that will enable you to scale. Do you want to go into that?
Sure, and I'll continue on the 3 C's poetic aspect and the alliteration of Alex, because 3 C's also guide the way in which we think about infrastructure, which is the question of choice. So the conviction that organizations should have choice, not only in terms of their models, but also in terms of how they keep their data, where they keep their data, and who has access to their data. Second aspect is really the question of confidentiality. So organizations of all sizes want to know that their data is safe, and they should. It should be a priority. So this question of centralizing security and sovereignty and responsibility by design is really in the DNA, in the ways in which AWS offers our infrastructure services. So confidentiality, second C, and then third, control over costs. Organizations want to be able to pay as you go and control what they are paying for, where they are paying for it, and how they are paying for it in terms of their use of cloud. And this is particularly important when you're thinking about the unbelievable effervescence that we talked about earlier in terms of AI adoption. AI and cloud go hand in hand. And actually, this hand-in-hand approach of AI and cloud also helps regions like, for example, Europe, meeting their decarbonization and twin digital and green transition goal. Because individuals and innovators want to be able to innovate, but they want to be able to innovate in a way that's not only responsible, but also sustainable. So that's something that we really centralize in the ways in which we make available and also expand our infrastructure, is how to empower innovators with this technology in a safe way, but how to make sure that the ways in which they're innovating is also sustainable. And it's manifested in the work that and the research that we continue to do on innovations at the silicon level in terms of our chips, Trainium and Inferentia, all the way to the ways in which we think about data center energy efficiency design, which we launched last year in reInvent, and the continued innovations that we continue to invest in terms of renewable energy.
And I guess you, as an AWS customer, come from the other angle that you're using this technology to create this modern infrastructure stack, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So Synthesia runs on AWS, and for us, it's very important because we offer a global service to be able to have the kind of stability and the control that you were talking about, because there are tens of thousands of organizations that rely on Synthesia. We're not just in these organizations, we're not like a pilot. We're actually, for some people, it's their day-to-day job to make content in Synthesia. And so it's very important for us that the platform runs smoothly and with good efficiency. And so I think as a startup, what's very important for us is to have access to the cloud and to be able to build services quickly and deploy them quickly. So I think there's been a lot of conversations around sort of sovereign AI and what that means. I think for us, what that means in practice is, rather than building these kind of like supercomputers, which sound good in practice, you're building a supercomputer. If you're doing academic research, that could be a good resource to have if you're a university and you want to build your own model. Potentially a supercomputer could be the way to go. But the challenge with these supercomputers is they're quite resource limited. Like you only have access to one supercomputer. If multiple universities, for example, want to use it at the same time, they might run into some bottlenecks. Whereas if you have this network of data centers that are globally distributed, you can deploy your services at scale. So again, when you're building if you're thinking about sort of sovereign AI, you should probably think about, first and foremost, how can I, if I'm a country and I want to have an AI industry, how can I help that industry flourish? Building supercomputers is probably is useful, but it's not sort of the only thing you should focus on. Probably another thing to focus on is, how can I allow more startups and scale-ups like us to grow and deploy their services? There are a lot of companies, or there have been a lot of companies previously where they had these kind of local ambitions or regional ambitions. I want to be the Uber of the UK. For us, I think it's much more important that we have, in Europe at least, that we have companies that have global ambitions. I don't want to be just a company successful in a country or region. I want to be successful globally. And if you have those ambitions, having an infrastructure that you can rely on that's distributed globally is really important.
Yeah, so we talked about amazing use cases in generative AI. We talked about the key things that will enable organizations to scale it, from starting with the why and the strategy to making sure people are on board, have the right skills, the right regulatory environment, the right culture, the right IT infrastructure.